Okay, lovely students. I hope all is well. We are going to start at basically the point where the class that was the furthest behind essentially uh, left off. So if you check your study guide and you've already filled out the first slide or two, then you can just skip ahead in the video. Okay? So we left off in one of the classes talking about the African American soldiers. And basically, by this point in the war, we're looking at like 1863, so 2 years into the war, there's been a lot of casualties. And the people in the North start to look around and they realize, well, there's a whole group of population that we haven't allowed to fight, and we've got a lot of people dying. If we allow these guys to fight, we stand a better chance of winning the war. So basically, they start to allow African Americans to join the army and to fight. One of the most famous regiments, which some of you guys did as a project, is the 54th Massachusetts. The movie Glory is based upon their experiences. They attacked at Fort Wagner. They were really popular, pretty well known. They were African American soldiers, and they were led by a white man. Okay, and by the end of the war, 180,000 African Americans served with the Union Army. So a ton of African Americans served in the Army in the North. Okay, so just some photographs here. This is Attack on Fort Wagner. In Glory, there's a really good depiction of it. Pretty cool movie. Some of the soldiers, and then this is Robert Goldshaw. He's the commander, basically, of the 54th Massachusetts. So, okay. Pictures. Hooray. All right. So, even though, there's a lot of support for the war, there's also a lot of opposition to the war. There's people that don't really necessarily agree with all of the things that are going on to it. And one of the main things that upsets people in the North is the Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves. And there were Democrats that were prevalent in the North that were opposed to the war because of their views on slavery, because of, well, a lot of different reasons. And Lincoln basically suspended something called habeas corpus, and essentially, if you were awesome. I wonder if you guys can even hear the announcement. Okay, so anyways, Lincoln suspends habeas corpus, and it basically allows him to imprison people that are speaking out against the war and all that kind of stuff, and keep them in prison. And today, if you get arrested, you have to be charged with something within 24 hours, or you can basically just walk out. You can be released, and Lincoln gets rid of that. So essentially, he was imprisoning people without really pressing any charges. In 1863, also because of the large number of casualties, a military draft is passed, and a lot of people don't really dig that a whole lot because it starts to force people into the service that, well, sometimes don't really necessarily want to be involved in the service. And part of this is because the poor people were being drafted more often than the wealthy people. And so it was deemed the rich man's war and the poor man's fight. Down south, because of the blockade, there wasn't a whole lot of trade going on. The supplies got cut off, and so everything that was valuable to the army, that was also valuable to people, shot up in prices. So like clothing, shoes, food, anything like that the army would need, because they were having a hard time with supply. It made it extremely expensive for civilians. So obviously, when prices go up because of a war, people don't really support the war a whole lot. And then because of that, Confederate money basically becomes worthless because it costs so much for things that the money just basically was kind of worthless. And lots and lots of food riots take place. There's some really famous ones that take place over in Tennessee and in Kentucky with some of the battles in the Western Theater. They were had these big surplus, or not surplus, supply houses basically, and the civilians decided to basically just steal the food from the army, and there was some outbreaks of fights and riots and things like that over the food. Um, and basically in the South there was also a draft law, but it made it so that anybody that owned slaves was exempt from the draft, and so this also exempted in the South the wealthy people. So again, this is the idea that this was a rich man's war because they were fighting over slavery, and well, only slave owners could afford them because they were wealthy, And so the poor people were being sent off to fight because of the slave owners were being exempted from this. And a lot of the states didn't really cooperate with the draft laws, and they kind of, obviously looked out for their own interests first. Okay, so on the home front, many men were obviously off to war. A vast majority of the men were off to war, and so the women basically had to fill in for the men. So they, did the farming, they did the factory work, they did all that kind of stuff. And a lot of women had important roles as nurses. Dorothea Dix, Clara Barton, who founds the Red Cross, who starts the Red Cross, and Sally Tompkins were all three famous kind of nurses that served for the military. And one of the projects, obviously, when we get to that point, camp life was very, very difficult. Prison camps were extremely bad. One of the projects that you guys have been working on is the prison camps. Andersonville was pretty horrendous. Johnson's Island up in Lake Erie in Ohio was pretty awful as well. Obviously, if you're having a hard time supplying your army, you're not going to be supplying the prisons that hold the enemy captive very well. So, you got to look out for your soldiers first, and then after that, everything else comes and falls into line. So, anybody that's captured as a prisoner of war is not receiving very good rations. And because of not very good medicine, because of prison life, twice as many soldiers die of disease than in combat. It's a pretty disturbing fact. The medical care is pretty awful. The projects that deal with medicine, you get a pretty good glimpse of that with implements that they use are pretty, gruesome and rudimentary. So they didn't really know how to treat infections. A lot of times, if there was an infection, they would kind of sometimes just amputate, and then the essentially the location of the amputation would become infected too. So it wouldn't really solve any issues. So here's a picture of a Union camp. You can see it kind of looks like a log cabin. Kind of cool. They got these duck boards to keep their feet dry. And this is a Confederate camp, kind of semi-similar. Lots of log cabins. This is a Union doctor performing an amputation. Lots of people stand around to watch. That's pretty convenient. I wouldn't want to be the guy on the table having a big crowd watching an amputation. If you're in a surgery and lots of people want to watch, it's probably not a very good surgery to be having. Ooh, some feet. Lots of feet. Pretty disgusting. There's gangrene. It's a fairly recent picture. Somebody's hand got infected, and it just keeps spreading. And basically all this is dead tissue. And so if they don't amputate, then this infection continues to spread. It's pretty gross. There's Union prisoners at Andersonville, looking pretty thin. Union Army cooks. Okay, now on to Gettysburg, which is kind of like the turning point of the war. So in July of 1863, Lee decides he's going to invade the North, and he hoped that if he invaded the North, that it would, basically make the people in the North feel very uncomfortable because their land was being attacked, and that they would basically just want to give up the fight and stop fighting. Okay, and he was also hoping that Europeans would come in and step in on their side and help them out. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about this because you guys are going to learn more about it with Killer Angels when you read that with Mrs. Hamby. But basically, there's lots of fighting going on over the course of these 3 days. The early stuff is pretty small scale, and then it kind of amplifies throughout the days.